Great. Okay, so welcome and thank you so much for joining us today for the session titled Be Careful What You Wish For, Post-HathiTrust ETAS Analysis and Implications for Future Monograph Acquisitions. So my name is Arielle Lomness and I am the Collections Librarian for the University of British Columbia's Okanagan campus up in Canada. And my co-presenter, Ellen George, wasn't able to join us for the full presentation today, so I'll be delivering this solo, but Ellen is still available in the chat for the first 10 minutes or so, in case anybody has any burning questions for her. So first off, I wanted to situate our two campuses and the cities, giving recognition and acknowledgement to the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territories of the Indigenous peoples that our university operates from. The Vancouver or Point Grey campus is situated on the territory of the Musqueam peoples, with many of their local outpost sites also sitting on the lands of the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. About 4 hours north by car is our Okanagan campus based in Kelowna on the land of the Syilx peoples. Both locations showcase many Indigenous crafted art installations to recognize the relationship and reconciliation that has and still needs to take place. And I welcome you all to share what territory you're joining us from today. And if you don't happen to know, please consider checking out nativeland.ca, who cover Indigenous territory breakdowns for around the world, including the United States, which I know a lot of you are joining us from today. So just for a little bit of background and context on the ETAS program and its use at UBC. So ETAS stands for the Emergency Temporary Access Service, which I know a lot of you will already know. And it started as part by HathiTrust as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic, limitations with circulating print copies of texts, and the closure of many libraries across North America. HathiTrust maintains an active list, a list of activated and deactivated schools that participated in the program as well on their website, if anybody is interested in seeing that. And to participate in the program, institutions had to maintain a certain level of membership with HathiTrust. And this was in order, sort of just, in order to have certain access to OCLC numbers, which for us, we actually had to upgrade our membership. So this was in order to actually have the OCLC mapping occur so that we could actually then pair with the HathiTrust holdings. And so many Canadian institutions signed on as well, but it did take some time for us in Canada to kind of see this play out with certain agreements as they were vetted for legal and copyright concerns, because Canada does have different needs from the US. And even between the provinces and the territories across Canada, there are many differences when it comes to the legalities around stuff like this. And so at UBC, we specifically ran the program for 14 months. So we started in July 2020 and it ran until August 2021, so only a couple months ago. There were some delays in getting the activation, but it did end up running all the way until we were able to reopen our doors to our patrons this academic term. And as we were getting set up to shut it off, we were even hearing about some schools in Canada, this is just more anecdotal, that they were considering saran wrapping their stacks to keep ETAS on, which seems like an extreme measure, but hilarious in and of itself. Most did end up shutting off the program, though, with the start of the academic term. And, the list on the HathiTrust website showcases that most schools have shut it off by this point in time. So in total, we had just over 450,000 print monograph records that were suppressed in our catalog, and then had those same electronic records, new ones reactivated for them in the system. So this is compared to a nearly 4 million monograph collection that we hold at UBC. And of note, we did not include our serials holdings in the ETAS program. So next, I'll quickly run through the data analysis process that Ellen and I partook in, and then also some of the caveats for the project and the data that we'll present on throughout the presentation. So first off, looking at sort of what the setup of this post-program analysis looked like, we worked with our library assessment team, and we ended up choosing Tableau to use over Excel. We had kind of talked about potentially using Excel, but Tableau had far more interactive abilities and it certainly paid off with what we were able to look at. In terms of the data, we were able to match the HathiTrust provided usage, as well as the Voyager circulation and in-house circulation browsing data that was for before the ETAS program. So merging those two together. We had plenty of preliminary questions going into looking at this data. This is just a few of them, but first off, we wanted to look at, of the print titles that had never circulated or hadn't circulated in the last 5 or 10 years, how many had usage as ebooks during the ETAS program, and trying to use that to distinguish whether or not there was any format preferences for ebooks over print books. We also wanted to see if there was any disciplinary patterns in the data around who was using the ETAS program. And then finally, we also wanted to look at how non-English language titles were being used in the program, and whether or not this could be used to convince non-English language publishers to release additional content as ebooks. So data caveats part 1, there's many data caveats. I think anytime you're working with large data sets, this should always be sort of flagged and well known about what the potential pitfalls are with your data. So first off, what is in HathiTrust ETAS? So predominantly it was English language titles, which can certainly show inflated usage and sort of appearances around English language titles, but stripping that away can show you a lot of other things around the non-English language content as well. It's predominantly humanities and social sciences titles. And additionally, there was some discrepancies just between, how we load a multi-volume series in our catalog for monographs versus how HathiTrust indicates this. And so individual volume numbers showing up in HathiTrust sometimes didn't match all the way to the title level. And so there were certain series that were not able to be properly matched with our data. So what did we include from our holdings? So predominantly our holdings was actually from a report from 2 years before we actually loaded this. So it was from 2018. And then we ended up doing a second load in October of 2020 that tried to catch up with some of this data. And what it also did was it tried to incorporate additional OCLC matches. So during that period of time, we noticed that a lot of our holdings did not have OCLC numbers included in them. And so they were not going to be end up part of this program. So we ended up actually including additional OCLC numbers over those few months and then reloading them in that second load. And this happens a lot with schools that may not have been using OCLC prior to the pandemic. And so this certainly is not a limitation that is unique to us. And then finally, there were a couple language exemptions that we just simply did not include in the holdings. So in terms of part 2 to the data caveats, why didn't you already own more of these as ebooks? So some of the titles we certainly did, but we still ended up including them in the program because we were shutting off the print access to them. Historically, we were also print preferred for preservation purposes as well as user preference. And so a lot of them were simply titles we had never thought to buy as ebooks previously. There were a couple titles that we did upgrade our ebook holdings of, so we could see that, usage was really taking off in HathiTrust, and we were seeing that, there were course requests for certain things, and we were able to pick them up as ebooks or upgrade them. In Canada, there's also just, less content available. In the United States, you get to see a lot more trade publications be made available. And so for us, there was a lot of content in HathiTrust, so this is the first time we've ever been able to get it as an ebook. Next, how were we tracking usage before? So of course, our data is only as good as the data that we had in our OPAC. And so looking back to our circulation data, it was only going back to 2004. Our in-house use data or browsing data only went back to 2011. So certainly there is, a lot of usage before that on some of these titles that isn't going to be captured in this data. And of course, there's going to be some branch specific workflows, of in-house use titles and in-house browsing, specifically around, does a reference title that gets left out on a table that was used, is it counted as an in-house browse or not? And there's just some of those discrepancies that we can't account for in the data. And then how consistent were language or subject headings being assigned? So in our data match, we did pull that content in to be able to then filter and look to see at, discipline usage and language usage, but this is always a work in progress and our holdings are not perfect, as is no schools. So this is always something that could be ameliorated. So reviewing the data, there is a lot to discuss, and the following slides showcase just some of the elements that we felt related back to answering some of our initial questions, but much more can be done with this in our opinion. So firstly, we're going to talk just a little bit about the summary data from our participation in ETAS. So this particular slide showcases the highest overview of the matched data for the analysis. There's 4 sort of breakdowns here, so I'll walk you through what each of these means. And apologies if you are looking at this on Zoom or in Pathable, this slide might look really tiny. So if you want to open up the slides, it is in the files section as well, if you want to see this larger as I'm going through. So electronic only denotes titles that were not circulated in print prior to ETAS, or at least not in the data that we had access to, but did receive electronic use during the 14 months. Print only denotes titles that only received print circulation prior to ETAS and received no electronic use during the 14 months. Both print and electronic denotes titles that received print circulation prior to ETAS and had electronic use during the 14 months. And no use denotes titles that had no circulation prior to ETAS and did not get used during the 14 months. So as you can see, over 70% of the titles, which was most of these, had actually seen no use whatsoever. So not during the program and not before the program, or at least not during the capturing of our data set. The second largest body of use, which was almost 28% of the titles, was only print use prior to the program. So when you actually get down to this, of the titles that were actually used during our ETAS, it was less than 2% of the 450,000 plus titles that saw electronic use in the ETAS program. So this constitutes approximately 5,700 titles, as you can see there. But we are going to talk about why, this small percentage of titles is still important to analyze, and some of the stuff that we were able to kind of get out of that usage. So focusing solely on the titles that were used during the program, we can see that even though it was a small portion of the titles we loaded, the use during ETAS was still twice as many as the titles that actually saw use. So you can see there's over 11,000 uses for those 5,700 titles, showing that, at least some of the titles were receiving multiple uses. And we'll touch on this later when we're talking about high use titles. So 3/4 of the titles used also saw print circulation prior to ETAS, but it's still great to see that 1/4 of this content was being used for the first time, or the first time in a very long time. And as you can see, the total use for print and electronic show significantly more print uses prior to ETAS than the use during the ETAS. And we'll need to drill down into the date of use to show if this was, for older publications and circulation dates, or if there was really a preference for print more recently. So to contrast the previous slide, this one showcases the breakdown of titles not used during ETAS. Note the data anomalies in ETAS use for print-only used titles. It's that 173 there. This is presumably just due to some of the holding loads timelines. It's not something that we're too worried about. And we can see that many print circulations for titles that saw no ETAS use. And so this led us to many different questions. So is this all old use back to 2004? Does this show that print is still a preferred format? And then what implications does this data have on long-term preservation of print monographs, our storage approaches, and our acquisitions approaches? So thinking more towards this and, how we can sort of use Tableau to pull lists in the future, kind of wondering, subject areas that see low or no print circulation, should some subject librarians halt print purchasing in the future? And also, could we argue for more storage facility approaches to housing print monographs? So do they really need to be on the shelf if it's being kept for preservation, but isn't actually circulating in print? And then digging a little bit deeper into those print-only used titles, we can see that an almost identical pattern of use over time. So no matter the publication date, so you can see on the left-hand side, it's all open to all publication dates, whereas on the right-hand side, we've limited it to 2000 to present. And you can see that that pattern is exactly the same. So it was clear that print use was going down, no matter the publication date. But we wanted to question whether or not the data would also show us that, electronic use was equally going down, signaling an overall decrease to the use of monographs. And I think, we weren't able to touch on that in this presentation, but this would be something to partner with, general counter statistics and things like that from ebook platforms where we can see whether or not over time there was a decrease in monograph use. And then finally, just to close up this summary section, this is a list of our content providers that had over 10 total titles used in the ETAS program. And as you can see, the University of Michigan, University of California is showing up as the highest, but it still isn't clear, or we weren't able to locate this easily for this presentation, just to see, are they also the holding institutions that have the most content in HathiTrust? Or whether or not this list matches who the overall content providers are for HathiTrust, or if this is a little bit kind of all over the place and perhaps certain institutions' content is being weighted more preferably for our users' needs. So now turning to no or low circulation titles and the influence they had on the data. So we had asked ourselves at the outset, of print titles that had never circulated or hadn't circulated in 5 or 10 years, how many of these had usage as ebooks via the ETAS program? So titles above never saw print use, but then got used during the ETAS electronically. And then you can see that they have been broken down by decade of publication. So this really shows us that older titles were getting discovered for the first time, or at least since 2004, when our circ data tracking started electronically. And some of these certainly might be out of copyright, which sort of begs the question, should digitization efforts be considered more fulsomely in the future? And as you can see, there's also a pretty steady average use per title. That's the gray row at the top. Showing that many titles were used 1.5 times though. So there's not as much consistent interest in a lot of the titles, but maybe they are being stumbled across in our catalog and access. We're not totally sure. And then also wondering, are these the ones that were in our storage facility? And perhaps these were being stumbled across for the first time because people couldn't browse them, right? Even if they were in person, these might have been titles that were kind of behind lock and key before. So kind of leaving us to wonder, would retaining ETAS access to our storage titles really foster greater browsability of our older content? So that's a really lingering question for us. So now looking over to answer the portion of the question that looked at the titles that hadn't circulated in print in the last 5 years, but received use during the ETAS. So you can see here, there were 3,398 titles that had not circulated in print from 2017 to present, but did see electronic use in ETAS. So it's amazing to see that the electronic use during ETAS surpasses the print use for those same titles. There's a clear interest in electronic versions of the titles that had previously been desired in print, leading us to wonder, is it because it's easier to access? Were the records easier to find? Do people actually take the step further to preview an ebook more than they would go and actually just, pick up the print book and skim it for a few pages to see if it's of interest to their topic? So I do think, this pattern really shows interest in that electronic format. And similarly, if you're looking at the titles that hadn't circulated in the last 10 years, but then saw use in ETAS, there was 1,145 titles that fit that description. And this number is included in the total that was on the previous slide, the 3,300. But it's showing, that there were twice as many titles then of recent print circulation that saw use during ETAS. So that really signaled to us that things that had been even consistently of use in print by circulation up until the last 5 years were still of interest in the program by ETAS for electronic use, whereas some of this older content kind of tapers off a little bit more with the overall uses, but still that same sort of pattern is showcased. So you see the pattern of interest and consistently higher than the titles for the electronic copies. And so it really shows that, even looking from 2011 to 2021, that's a big jump, right? So we're seeing some great patterns around the electronic preference. So jumping over to, we're going to highlight the subject and disciplinary influences that we picked up on in the data, and keeping in mind that we couldn't drill down to every subject area, but we really do see this as a way into working with our subject librarians who might be able to draw additional conclusions for their acquisitions work from some of this. So the first diagram here shows only the total number of titles that were used throughout the 14 months of ETAS, and then those are broken down by LC class. So you can see there, language and literature surpasses all the others, which is generally not surprising. And same thing with general and old world history being second. And, these are who our heavy users are. So this was not shocking to us when we saw this. What was more surprising, though, was, medicine and sciences showing up in the top 10. And we had to wonder whether or not the availability of ebooks for older content is simply so sparse in those areas that users took advantage of having access when they could. And we'll see this pop up again in the next slide. So this particular breakdown shows the electronic only titles, so no print circulation, and print and electronic use titles, which had print circulation before ETAS, by LC class, as well as by the total amount of titles, total amount of uses of those titles, and then finally the average amount of uses per title in that class. So as you can see, Q shows a huge average use by title, meaning that there were few titles that were used, but those that were used, they were used many times. And so this really begs the question, do our Q users really want print? Or is it because we can't buy them very many ebooks in general? And so similar to why we were seeing science pop up on the top 10 used LC classes on the previous slide, we really attribute that to kind of being of an important flag to us and speaking to the science's interest in this. And then additionally with P, it shows the most E only use, meaning that it had the most first-time use as electronic use in the ETAS program, followed by D and B and H. But if you blew up the proportions, specifically of the bottom row, you might see that the actual proportion of electronic first-time use compared to the overall use, the overall titles might be more in line across the board. And then as for the literature, this was really surprising to me for P, but perhaps our users are becoming more used to reading novels from their devices. That was one speculation that we had. There are also, again, things that we often can't buy in Canada. And speaking again to those trade publications, this is, that LC class that we often can't pick up as ebooks in Canada. And so it's not that surprising that we're seeing high titles there. And then when we drill down into the LC classes that had over 1,000 uses during ETAS, and then we break those down by subclass, we can see a deeper look at our users' interests. So on this particular slide, you can see P was a class that had over 1,000 uses. And then when you're looking at this, the subclass breakdown, PS saw the most uses within P at 503 uses across the ETAS. So knowing that, we have a large focus on Asian studies, as well as Canadian literature at our institution, these findings are not super surprising, but instead extremely validating for what we were expecting to see. And then this slide, we just wanted to drill into some of the titles a little bit more that were coming up as used titles in the program and focusing on specific topics and locations that are of specific interest to our users, and we know that. So looking at Indigenous content, Asian language content, Canadian content, anti-racist content. A lot of this just seeing how often people were finding and using content in these areas. So this was an interesting thing to kind of pull out and something that we could certainly do more work on in the future. So also of importance at our institution are the language influences on ebook availability, which I mentioned already. So as many titles aren't available to us to purchase in electronic access for non-English language content. So we were really curious to kind of look at what this meant in the data. So breaking this down, this particular slide shows the breakdown of all the languages that make up what UBC loaded to ETAS. And as you can see, English is primarily there, unsurprising. And this is something that you'll see at all institutions pretty much that participated in the ETAS program. But we were happy to see a lot of diversity in those sort of secondary, tertiary languages showing up. And then you can also see, looking only at the titles that were used during the program, English remains the default when you look at the spread of language, but when you actually look at the average uses per title, which is on the right-hand side, you can see how other languages start to pop up, showing that there were more important works in those other languages that were needing to be accessed. So fewer titles that were being used, but they were being used multiple times, which was great to see. This particular slide shows all of the non-English language titles that circulated in print before the program in blue and electronic use during the program in orange. So again, you can see this drastic spike, which shows a very clear non-English language title preference when it comes to ebooks. But keeping this with a grain of salt, as you can see, the total uses only goes to 600. So that baseline is a little bit smaller, but in general, this is a really good pattern of use to show the non-English language needs. And similarly to the previous slide, but only with the English language titles, you can see the baseline for the English language titles, does affect this. Now we're up to 6,000. And the spike in electronic use is not as high over time for the English language titles, but it's still much higher than what we were seeing for 2018, 2019 for print circulation totals. So we would argue again that this demonstrates strong interest in electronic access preferences, and presumptions being that it is, the ease of use, instant gratification that's driving some of this uptake. So finally, we wanted to get a better understanding of our high use titles that were showing up at ETAS. And so we took the first 50 and we analyzed these. And so just looking through them, there was a couple points that we picked up on. 17 of them were actually available to purchase as ebooks out of the top 50. And of those, 2 of them were actually $800 USD for a 1 user seat. So really signaling that textbook interest. And we also saw a wide range of publishers that were listed in this set, and many of them were textbook publishers. And including in that, 9 of them were actually actively listed as being used in our courses. And this really signaled how important this service is for gaining access to course content, because otherwise these students would have only had access to them in print, using them maybe for an hour at a time, sharing the copy. It's way more feasible to have the online access. The date range span that we saw for these ranged from 1955 to 2019. And then it really spanned all of the LC classes, but in particular, our 50 titles that were the top used were around fiction, art, and music. So now just to close out, I have some general conclusions and findings from our analysis. So we really felt that we had lofty goals for this analysis, but we were left realizing that we were really only scratching the surface of what could be done with this data and the impact that it could have on our library acquisitions processes, monograph management, and advocacy in librarianship. So we came out with far more questions than we entered. And while this often can signal a failed experiment, we felt it actually showed great opportunity for future discussions. So when we're thinking about how this program fits into the future of controlled digital lending, which I know has already been a hot topic at this conference, and shared print or ebook initiatives, we can see the advantage of using this kind of data to paint a picture of its usefulness for our institution. And while we know that this is still a long ways off for us in Canada due to a lot of legal and copyright reasons, we do see the role in advocating for better access. So we can also see, the potential of some untapped conversations around such topics as storage versus open shelving, the impacts that this can have on users' experience with books, and whether this can be replicated using digital interfaces. And furthermore to this, users may be more likely to browse an electronic sample of a book rather than wait for a print title to come in to skim it. If it's out of sight, it's out of mind, and even if it's coming up in the catalog. So the need to keep a copy of everything versus keeping what our users are actually actively looking to use. This is really questioning our role in the bigger picture of preservation. Also looking at the need to support the digitization of out of copyright materials to increase accessibility. Furthermore, questioning the subject-specific format preferences and the impacts this has on subject librarians and selectors. So included in this is also, the topic around languages. As we saw with the non-English language materials, they have a great desire for electronic use, and perhaps that means reinvesting in finding packages and title by title offers for this content, even if this means complicated workflows and additional time and expertise in ordering. And of importance is perhaps going back to see what older content might now have a higher user base as an ebook and might be available for purchase individually. And, additionally, the challenge of course adopted texts continuing to be from a typical anti-e-textbook for libraries publishers. When will there be better offerings for us to support our students? I don't know, but, this really needs to be taken into consideration. Or perhaps, faculty need to be considering to use other content in the ways that they educate. Furthermore, how can we incite change with the high use publishers to see a need to offer more electronic content, especially around back files and out of print or out of copyright materials? This would certainly help to paint a better picture around this sort of program and this use. And, finally, if we had a dedicated collections assessment team rather than just one for our whole library, we could have done a deeper dive into a lot of these topics. But for now, we're going to call upon our colleagues locally to kind of come together, discuss the implications for their own respective areas. And it's really the hope that the Tableau report that we had built for us really builds, the bridge to that content. And finally, we have to wonder was ETAS worth it? And, the usage versus the amount of time of work that went into actually setting this up and taking it down was vastly different, but we wouldn't have really known if we didn't do it. So hopefully other institutions felt the same by participating, and we'd love to hear more about whether others have utilized their ETAS data to inform local discussions. We know that the University of California released similar findings in a summative report available online last month, along with survey findings from their users. And it's a really great read if you want to check it out. I can put the link into the chat afterwards. And of course, the University of Connecticut's poster session at this conference as well talks a little bit about how they use their data. So hopefully we can have a lively discussion about this for the last few minutes, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Arielle. And we do have some questions from some of our virtual attendees.
Great.
Quickly. Okay, Robert asks, were ETAS records more discoverable than ebook records? We were surprised to see ETAS usage when we already had the ebook.
Oh, interesting. Okay. We didn't look specifically at that, but that would be very interesting to look at, especially around titles that also had ebooks already. What I will say is that for us, I kind of commented at the beginning, the limitations with having certain subject headings not always be so fulsome in some of our records, sometimes not having those OCLC numbers in there, and they might have been added later. I actually think perhaps the ETAS records that we received were more fulsome in some of those disciplines than they were regularly seeing for our average users. So I do actually think it was more advantageous in our particular context, but that may vary based off of records that every institution has. That's probably going to look different.
Okay, when Shara asks, when ETAS ended, did you take the ebook data you gleaned and use it to purchase ebook copies of those used?
Yeah, so we did do a little bit of that, and we're kind of actively still trying to do that. So Ellen started with the top 50, as you saw, that I presented on. And so she worked through with those. But what we're hoping to do after this in the coming weeks is actually do a sort of a brown bag session with all of the librarians at our institution that do selections so that they can actually start to drill into more of that data and select in their areas. Because we didn't want to do it necessarily centrally and take that power away from them, because a lot of that buying power is still resting with the subject librarians at our institution. So we want to get them more engaged with it.
Okay. They're wondering if the ETAS uses were actual uses or just triggered by someone opening the book and not actually using it.
Great question. And you can, you know what, the University of California report actually goes a lot more in depth around this, because they actually surveyed all of their users and kind of got some data around, you know, how often were people just clicking in. What I will say anecdotally, though, even as somebody that tried to use it as a collections librarian, it took a lot of steps. I feel like people would have abandoned ship pretty early on a title unless they were committed to at least looking to see if it was relevant. So while yes, I'm sure there was a lot of those kind of fly by night, opened and closed sort of situations, I do think a lot of the use is probably legitimate because it did involve a lot of steps to get into the titles.
Laura asks, how were uses defined? And is each use a unique user? Did a use have to reach a certain length of time, reading versus browsing, before being counted?
It's a great question. And I would say that would be best directed to HathiTrust, who decided to define that sort of use description on their own. As far as I'm aware, it's just opening the title. I don't believe it involved any timestamp. As you'll see with, you know, streaming videos and other content, I think it was just a strict opening.
And Ria asks, how do these complicated patterns relate to print and ebook usage pre-pandemic as compared with the entire collection? For example, how are the LC ranges in use with HathiTrust related to print and ebooks?
Can you reread the
sorry,
first part of the
I
question?
did go fast.
Yeah.
How do these complicated patterns relate to print and ebook usage pre-pandemic as compared with the entire collection?
Yeah, so I would say, you know, we tried to merge the pre-pandemic print use back to what we had back to 2004 in this presentation. So we're able to see that, but we did not merge it with ebook use. And I do think that that's an important next step with this. If we want to sort of take this seriously and understand, you know, that sort of question that I posed at the beginning around, does this show overall monograph use declining? We're going to have to look at that ebook use and pair it with it. We just did not have that extra time to incorporate that into the Tableau report, but it would be very interesting to do.
Crystal asks, what impact do you think remote online course delivery during this period had on the preference for electronic versus print use during this period?
Oh, I think it had a huge impact. I mean, I think everybody was moving to electronic. They had to. We linked to a number of records in ETAS from our course reserve system that were incorporated into different classes. And when we had to shut that off, there was certainly complaints. We were not without complaints, but we had to open our doors, right? And I guess saran wrapping was an option, maybe stanchions of some kind, but we took the path that we felt was going to have the least resistance, even if there was still going to be some resistance. And so I do think it's going to have a huge impact going forward. You know, the students are going to vocalize what they want. I think a lot more out of this pandemic. They're going to probably, especially as we're moving into hybrid courses too, where perhaps some weeks are in person, some weeks are online, that I do think electronics is going to continue to stick around.
Sunshine asks, do you do any factoring in print usage for years on the shelf to normalize the data? I just lost it.
No, not in this particular data set. I think I understand what they're asking. No, we didn't factor in, like, if we'd added a title that was published in 1970 only 5 years ago. No, we didn't normalize the data with that sort of overlay. No.
Okay, I'm trying to think. Oh, do you use in-house use as a measure?
Yeah, we incorporated the in-house use. So that's included in the anytime something got signaled as a print use in our Tableau report, it might either was a formal circulation or it was an in-house browse statistic that got matched. But because every branch sort of tracks those differently, there's going to be a lot of data anomalies with that. And perhaps a lot of uses missing.
Okay. I think that's it for questions from our virtual attendees.
Great. And I think we're right on time, so that's perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. I've been really enjoying this. And if there's other questions, please put them in the chat and I'll try and check Pathable later on today and answer a few more if there's anything that comes up.